is criminal behaviorology. To assist the criminal and civil justice systems. To improve our society. A podcast like no other. Here is your host, Timothy Joseph.
Hello, this is Criminal Behaviorology, and I am your host, Timothy Joseph. Great to be in touch with you again. We did not have an episode in November, but this episode is going to close out the year for us, and it's been quite a year. We got through it. I think that this particular interview is a great way to finish off 2020 because it's interesting and it's different, and I hope you'll enjoy it. This is the result of meeting author Nicolas Tredell at a conference in 2018. He has edited a new book that focuses on the Truman Capote novel, famous novel, In Cold Blood. So in this interview, we discuss the infamous Clutter family murder as written about in Capote's world-famous work, as well as the many film and television incarnations and the influence of the writing of the true crime novel as it impacts us today. Some of the highlights are the shocking nature of the Clutter family murder and how such a crime would be compared to a similar crime today. The psychology of the perpetrators, the social psychological factors involved, the folie à deux, which is madness for two element in this murder, pertinent issues in this case, including insanity as a defense and the death penalty and so forth. What is appealing in regards to Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood and some of the innovative techniques that he had in his writing. What's special about the true crime novel as a work of literature and why true crime remains so popular. The accuracy of these kinds of based on a true story type of novels and movies. And Capote's possible insight into how our changing world was relevant to the Kansas murders that he writes about in Cold Blood. Crimes motivated by self-esteem and how our modern life, highway travel, technology, and other factors all contribute to crimes manifested in new ways in this day and age. So go ahead, we'll get to the interview. You'll really enjoy it. He's a great speaker, and have a great rest of the year 2020, as well as have a happy new year. Let's go ahead and get to the interview. Okay, Nicolas Tredell, how are you today?
I'm good, yes, and you yourself?
I'm doing quite well. It's about it's a little after 6 a.m. here, and it's a little after
goodness, yes.
11
a.m.
a.m.
later here. Yeah, that's right, yes.
I see you have many books in the background, so you're an avid reader.
Do.
Yeah.
Yes, I am indeed, yes. Yeah. All over the house, in fact, and a certain creative disorder up here in my bedroom. So the way I like to think of it.
Controlled chaos, then.
That's the way to look at it.
Okay, yes. So we met in 2018 at the Colin Wilson Conference.
That's correct, yes.
Yes,
indeed.
And you were a speaker there.
That's right, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
How did you get involved in that venue, and what's your interest in Colin Wilson?
I've been interested in Colin Wilson's work since my early teens, in fact. I encountered his first book called The Outsider, which was a philosophical book, and also his first novel called Ritual in the Dark, which is, in fact, about a serial killer. So you can perhaps see a certain link to my interest in Cold Blood in that respect. And it was a book that Wilson himself was very interested in.
And it likewise for me, so it's a lot of that in criminology. So it's what started the podcast and the effort, so there's a connection in there. Right. Well, before we go into that, maybe just a little bit of background. So In Cold Blood was written by Truman Capote.
That's right, yes.
And tell us a little bit about the book and then the story behind it.
Capote had established himself very successfully as a novelist, a short story writer, and a journalist, but he was looking for a new project, and he saw this item in the New York Times, a family of 3 that had been slain in Holcomb in Kansas, and he thought this would be an interesting topic, perhaps initially for an article. So he went down there in the aftermath of the murder. He took with him his childhood friend, Nell Harper Lee, who was about to become famous with the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. And so they went down there, and they began researching it together. And Harper Lee was probably very helpful to him in that respect, though both of them, because they'd come from a very small town in Alabama, they'd grown up there, they knew what small town life was like. And it's worth saying, because it's interesting in relation to what then happened, is that initially, of course, the idea was from the KBI, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, that the murder had been committed by somebody local. That was the notion. So when they first went down, there was a great deal of uneasiness and fear and suspicion in the town as to who had committed the murders. It turned out, of course, to be somebody from far away, and that made a great deal of difference to the way then the whole book proceeded. What was then crucial is that a long delay ensued after the conviction of the murderers, before the sentence was carried out. We're looking at a murder that took place late in 1959. The executions weren't carried out until the mid-60s. And so in that period, Capote got to know the killers very well. And so quite a lot of the material it comes from his later conversations with him, what they told him, and what in particular, what one of them, Perry Smith, told him about the murders. And there was this rather grim sense that Capote couldn't really finish the book until Dick and Perry had been executed, had been hanged. That made his good ending. So it created a very complex situation, as you can imagine. So that's the story of the book. There's a lot more to say about it, but that's how it happened. It was almost in a way by accident. If these murders had taken place and Capote hadn't come along, they would have certainly had a grim place in the annals of true crime, but they wouldn't have achieved anything like the prominence they achieved when Capote was already a well-established literary figure. Turned his attention to it.
And they were not, when he had gone down there to investigate the case, they had not been captured yet, right? They were captured while he was there.
Absolutely. When he first went down there, there was still the idea that this was an inside job, that someone local had done it. The Clutter family were highly respected in the community, but it's also fair to say they aroused in some quarters a certain amount of envy and resentment. And so there was a feeling that it was a local job. And it wasn't until the remarkable coincidence of a convict called Floyd Wells, who had been once shared a cell with Dick, hearing about the murder on the radio and remembering that when they'd been selling together, he had told Dick about this wealthy farmer, Herbert Clutter, for whom he worked, who Floyd Wells believed had a great deal of money. If Floyd Wells had been elsewhere or hadn't been listening to that radio broadcaster and died earlier, it's quite possible that the link would never have been made, simply because they came from so far outside the community. They weren't a part of it as originally been suspected. So the KBI investigation went in quite a different direction to what had originally been expected. And it's always worth, I think, remembering that, as they say, when Capote and Harper Lee first went down there, the idea was that somebody local was the most likely suspect. Indeed, they suspected for a time Bobby Rupp, who was Nancy Clutter's boyfriend. They thought he might have done it. And there was that atmosphere, but they did, of course, then come from a long, long way away, and without Floyd Wells, the connection might never have been made.
And Perry Smith and Richard Hickock had misconstrued that that the Clutter family spent some $10,000 a year on the farm they misconstrued that as they have $10,000 at the farm. You have written a book then about In Cold Blood, and you participated with some other authors. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, yes, certainly. Well, I had, of course, read the book anyway, and there was a series called Critical Insights, which gathers together, published by Salem Press, which gathers together a range of essays from a variety of perspectives on various texts. And I was interested in doing that because I was interested in the book itself. I was interested in murder, partly through my interest in Colin Wilson and the ways in which you might write about murder. So I set out to do that. And I must stress that this was very much a joint effort, that all the people who contributed to it offered all kinds of perspectives from a whole range of angles: literature, journalism, psychology, trauma theory, criminology, and such like. And it's another reason, I think, in terms of why the book remains so fertile, is that it does have something to offer all of those perspectives. So it was a question of assembling the essays together, and it was a very interesting and to some extent harrowing process, because it did mean constantly coming up against the reality of this crime, the difference between true crime, if you like, and fictional crime.
This is the beginning of the true crime novel. At least that was that well known. That was Capote's contribution to literature, is what In Cold Blood was. Could we describe it that way?
Yes, I think so to some extent. There had been novels made on novels, that is fictional novels, based on real life crimes before. For example, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, published in 1925, or Mayor Levin's Compulsion, published in 1957, which was based on the Leopold and Loeb case, which, although Leopold and Loeb were much wealthier than Dick and Perry, it does have some similarities, because you had the two criminals coming together again. But there'd be nothing, I think, quite like this, and nobody of quite that literary stature, I think, who had turned to this writing about true crime. It was obviously, you had these lots of magazines, say in the 1950s, I can remember them in England myself, like True Crime, True Detective. They were around in the 1930s too, because Colin Wilson used to read all his mother's when you would get them in. But this was actually taking it into a different zone, I think, which has had a great subsequent influence on all kinds of crime, true crime writing.
So what is it about this case that is so special? There's something very intriguing about it. So it's essentially a home invasion, robbery, murder.
Yes.
There's something very special about it. What can you tell from just your research on it? What can you tell us?
Well, I think there are several factors. One is that the Clutters were a very successful, positive, productive family. Herb Clutter was a farmer, but he had been appointed by President Eisenhower to one of the federal farm boards. There's a very interesting interview with him in 1954, well before the murders took place, in the New York Sunday Times magazine. And he reveals himself as a very thoughtful, intelligent farmer. He'd been to Kansas State University, he had a degree, he ran his farm like a successful business. He was already active on it. And the sense was, as indeed somebody said, somebody in Holcomb said at the time, that they were the last people to be murdered. They were in some sense almost a perfect American family of the 1950s, compared sometimes to families in a Norman Rockwell painting, for example. So I think there was that sense. There was the shock of this invasion, both of the home and of the whole community. So I think that was that factor. And I think the other element, perhaps, that was particularly intriguing is that there was a kind of disjunction between the apparent motive and what actually happened. This goes back to what you said earlier about Dick and Perry were under the misconception that there was a large amount of money on the premises. Ironically, as we know from the book, Herb Clutter, even in those days, very rarely paid by cash. Even for quite small amounts, he would use checks as much more in anticipation of how we live now in a cashless society. So that was a particularly ironic factor. And it, of course, relates to the fact that Dick and Perry didn't really do their research very well. And you have the robbery was the ostensible motive for what they did. But if they had been simply aiming to carry out a robbery, they wouldn't have needed to do the murders. On one level, there's a very comic moment where they're heading towards Holcomb and the Clutters, and it's suggested that they should get masks to cover their faces. And Dick is actually sent into a convent with the idea that he'll ask the nuns for some black stockings they can use as masks. And he comes back and he bottles out. He feels he can't do it. So even that elementary precaution, they could have put masks on. They could have been more careful about disposing of the boots that they used. And when they found out, and they did establish this quite early on, that there wasn't any money there, they could have just gone. And in certain moments, Perry Smith wanted to go, but they didn't. They went ahead with what were quite unnecessary murders in terms of achieving any objective of money that they had. And so I think one gets a sense of this, that the robbery was really the pretext. What they really wanted to do was to kill. And Dick in particular emphasizes this. He says, we must leave no witnesses. He was a very unpleasant phrase, spatter the walls with hair. In other words, blow people's heads off with a shotgun. So I think that too is very striking. But they're not like, for example, Leopold and Loeb, or the two other killers who came onto death row when Perry and Dick were there, York and Latham. I don't know if you know about this particular case, but York and Latham were two soldiers. One was 18, one was 19. And they embarked on a killing spree. They killed 7 people, men, women, before they ended up being convicted in Kansas and ended up on death row and eventually ended up being hanged. And when they were asked why, they said, we hate the world. And they were just doing it for kicks, that kind of sensation. But in a sense, they were upfront about it. They weren't pretending to rob anyone. There was no financial benefit. The German term, the Lustmorde, the murder that is done for joy, for kicks. And I think it's that sense that that's really, on one level, if you look at them as robbers, they're highly inefficient amateurs, terrible bunglers. But that wasn't really the point. And I think that fascinates people too, how what might have been an apparently banal robbery turns into this full-scale murder where they seem to be expressing some kind of general resentment of society, of the world. And it's shocking. And as I say, it links up with Leopold and Loeb. It links up with York and Latham. It's that sense of a folie à deux, a murder of two, a shared psychosis, if you like, that you get with them as well. And I think that too is compelling, because you do get quite a strong sense when you read about them. And both in Cold Blood and other material that's been made available, that left to themselves, neither one of them would have committed a murder. Perry Smith claims he's killed someone. He claims he's killed this African-American called King a few years ago. But there's a feeling he's just boasting about that. And this, in fact, was investigated by the KBI. Harold and I investigated it. He could find no evidence of that. Perry also claimed to have thrown a man, sometimes as a policeman, off a bridge when he was in Japan, when he was in the USA. But again, there's no evidence of this. And again, it sounds rather like boasting. Perry might not have killed if he hadn't met Dick. Dick, even more, would not have killed, one feels, obviously you don't know, if he hadn't met Perry. So it was that folie à deux, that combination that was so startling and shocking.
So the case kind of gets into the nature of it makes us wonder about the psychology of the perpetrators. And then there's this shocking element of this untouched Midwest American perfect family now coming in contact with the worst elements in a senseless crime.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes. It is that sense of senselessness that comes up again and again as you read it. The disproportion between their ostensible robbery motive. They didn't end up with anything more than about $40 and a portable radio, and what they actually did. But I think if one suggests that their real motive was to go on a killing spree, then and the robbery was just a kind of pretext for getting it going, then I think that becomes more understandable, perhaps, as far as anything like this can be understood.
And there's a social psychological factor of the two of them coming together, making this happen. That
yes.
Would a case like this, I don't know, in England or I wonder in the United States, would it even get beyond the local news in this day and age?
Perhaps not. I think it might still do because of the victims. In other words, if they had just let's say killed a much poorer farming family or something like this, it might have attracted some attention, but not as much. It was the sense that they had picked the most almost the most prominent family in the district, not quite the richest, but perhaps almost the most prominent family in the district. So I think there was that sense. But I think also one has to say, of course, one is probably much more used to, through television, social media and such like, to hearing about crime now. Capote read about this, as I say, in the New York Times. Today you'd be hearing about it on Twitter or Facebook, probably before anything else, and all kinds of comments would come in and you get all kinds of issues that arise around it. So we are in I suppose in some sense, a more innocent age, when certainly murders did take place, but something like this was peculiarly shocking, yeah.
And Capote, with Nell Harper Lee's help, then he became quite involved in it wasn't just writing about it. He went down there, met with the police, and then ultimately met with the perpetrators themselves while they're in prison. Yes,
he was very much involved in it. Harper Lee, it should be said, was probably very important to him initially. If you've ever seen Capote, he was this diminutive guy with this very high voice, very camp. And he did know something about small town life, but he came from. But Harper Lee was important in smoothing the way for him. She was important in interviewing people, taking notes, all those elements, building a bridge for him to get to know the townsfolk. But Capote certainly went in there, and in particular, he got to know the leading KBI agent, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation agent, Alvin Dewey, a tall, rangy Texan, really, in many ways, an admirable all-American hero. And he got close to Dewey. In fact, later on, Dewey and his wife and Capote became friends. You can see on YouTube various newsreels of Capote taking them around New York and taking them sometimes to fashionable parties. So he really got to know Dewey well. And so that was very important because it gave him privileged access to information. It's perhaps worth saying, however, that there has been some controversy after that he overemphasized Dewey's prominent role. Dewey was an investigator, there's no doubt about that, but Harold Nye, for example, who was another KBI investigator, also made some very important contributions. And it really was, if you look at it, and you can infer this from the book, it's quite emphasized in the 1996 film that this was police teamwork that did investigative teamwork that tracked down, eventually tracked down the killers, and also got them to confess when questioning them separately. But then you're right, he did get to know the killers. He felt, and I think this is fairly well known, it comes across in both the film about Capote and the film also about Capote called Infamous, made respectively in 2005.
I have not seen that one. I've seen Capote, I think it was 2006 you referenced. But.
Yes, Infamous came soon after. It's interesting. It's got an English actor called Toby Jones playing the part. He does it somewhat differently, but he does it quite well. And so you have those two films which are about Capote himself, and he identified to some extent with Perry Smith. Capote too had a very neglected childhood. He'd been left. His parents weren't actually cruel to him, but they just weren't bothered about him. He got left alone in hotel rooms with the door locked, for example, from the age of about 2. Perry Smith had also had a very bad childhood. He'd been abused in various ways. They were both rather diminutive. Capote, biologically, Smith as a result of a motorbike accident he had that had shattered his legs. And Capote felt that a kind of, there but for the grace of God, I might have gone in that direction. And that lay behind it. Very fraught, because there was a feeling in some quarters. There was a notorious attack by a rather acerbic English theatre and book critic called Kenneth Tynan that suggested that Capote hadn't really done enough to try to help, particularly Smith, to secure a reprieve. And it's been suggested, and again, I don't have a definitive judgment on this, and it's been suggested that Capote didn't do that because he knew that the best way to end the book would be with a hanging, or 2 hangings in this case.
Was the movie, at least the Capote movie, accurate that he helped get them a new attorney that would help them file appeals, and they got a stay of execution, at least for a period?
They did get several stays of execution, and he did help them to some extent. But as time progressed, his attachment to them, and particularly to Perry, became more remote. And he didn't perhaps do, if one feels that he should have done something to try to retrieve them, he didn't do as much as perhaps he might have done. That is the feeling. But he certainly helped them early on. And of course, he helped them in another way, because a lot of what they did when they were in prison was writing. Dick became a great student when he wasn't reading Harold Robbins' paperbacks of the law, and he would go through law books. He would then write appeals, write to government agencies, write to lawyers to try and secure a reprieve. And Perry, of course, wrote a great deal. He also drew a great deal. Another point about them is that when they were assessed by the various psychiatrists, it was said that both of them were of above average intelligence. And Perry certainly had artistic leanings. It doesn't, of course, excuse what they did, but it is nonetheless significant of this kind of murderer, the kind of murderer that Colin Wilson was interested in. They're not stupid or mindless, generally speaking. They had these considerable abilities. And even if you look at Dick's career as a con man, when he's hanging paper, passing these done checks all the time, it's clear he was, in fact, very skillful at this. He'd get people to like him. He could get people to believe him. He could take them in. So again, you get that sense of they had abilities that one wishes they might have used in some more positive way. And that too, I think, adds to the poignancy of the whole event. They just shouldn't have been killing people.
And that was Smith that had those kind of con man type manipulative.
That was Dick. He was the con man. What they would do, they do it after the murders on several occasions. They would go into shops. This is quite well shown in some of the films. And he would say, for example, there's one where he says to the assistant, "Look, I'm with this guy, Perry Smith. This little guy here, he's getting married. He needs a new suit, you see. So let's try and fit him out with a suit." And Dick says, "Well, I'm going to need a new suit too." And so he gets the suit as well. And then he goes to pay. He says, this is before the age of credit cards, of course. I haven't got enough cash with me, but I can write you a check.
Yes.
And he was successful in doing this. Perry would watch him with fascination. And so he hung paper quite a lot of the time. So in that respect, he if you can talk about a successful criminal, he was, but he wasn't a big time criminal, in fact. So there's that interesting element too.
So Hickock had the kind of the classic sociopathic tendencies of being a liar, being a criminal, and,
yes.
And Perry Smith's personality we could describe how so, because I know from the film Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman, he kind of got close to Perry, and he was with the two of them all the way up to their execution.
Yes, yeah. Yes, he comes on the execution, yeah.
And so they kind of portrayed Perry Smith as, I don't know if that's the right word, but the more sensitive of the two, or, a little more maybe emotionally complex, I guess you could say.
Yes, I think that's right. He was, as you say, more sensitive. He had artistic aspirations. There's a picture of Christ he drew, for example, that a priest who was seeing him was very moved and affected by. Whereas Dick, yes, was more of a classic sociopath in many ways. We should also, since it's mentioned, add paedophilia to his crime list. He although he'd actually been married twice and had children, he could not settle down to any kind of normal family life. So yes, he was a sociopath. Though it's also important to say, and part of the reason why he can be so disturbing, and both the movies of In Cold Blood bring this out, he could also be very charming. But Perry was the more sensitive one, but he was also arguably the more dangerous figure. In fact, one of the things it suggested is that one of the reasons they teamed up, one of the reasons that Dick teamed up with Perry is that Dick saw that Perry could carry out the killings he couldn't himself. He felt Perry could do this, and so he's a fascinating character. But he has got this tough side. He may not have killed anybody, but he'd been in the U.S. Army, he'd been in Japan, he'd got a gold star, he'd been court-martialed on at least one occasion for breaking up a Japanese bar. He would probably be the more dangerous, although he was rather short, he'd probably be the more dangerous figure to meet in a fight than Dick, where you feel he would quite soon back down. So, but I think the contrast you draw is absolutely right between a more sociopathic Dick and a more sensitive Perry, but also a very dangerous Perry if he was roused. His father said that when he got into a fight, he was like a buzzsaw. And I suspect that's probably true. And as I say, he would be the truly dangerous one. And there's still, it should be said, there's still some debate about who actually carried out the murders. Perry seems to have taken the rap for them all. He did them all. That's essentially his claim. There is another account, supposedly written by Dick, in which he says he did at least two of them. We don't quite know what the case is. Again, it's the case of them sparking off each other. But certainly there was a sense that Dick had that Perry could kill more easily than Dick could, and that too goes back to the folie à deux, the two people who come together who might not have killed otherwise, and striking this lethal chemistry.
If I may,
Yes.
It says so your book is critical insights.
Yeah.
About in critical insights in Cold Blood.
Yeah.
It is a tightly concentrated, finely honed work that within its comparatively compact compass contains multitudes and ventures into the most dangerous territory with disturbing aplomb.
Yes.
The wide-ranging collection of in-depth original essays probes into a variety of aspects of the book itself, the critical responses to it, its cinematic adaptations, and the many literary, cultural, ethical, psychological, and philosophical issues that it raises. And you point out David Hayes poses a question: why does In Cold Blood remain a classic? It's still admired by so many nonfiction writers. It's taught in schools, translated into more than 30 languages, made into 4 movies, and still among the best-selling true crime books ever published. So that's what would you say? What would you say about that? So that's kind of like this the social psychological aspects of it, the social dynamic of it. All these things make it so popular after all these years.
I think they do. I mean, I think one probably has to start by saying that it's in my view, but I think in the view of most people who've read it, it is very well written.
Mm-hmm.
It's Capote, as I said toward the beginning, had established himself as an accomplished novelist, and particularly an accomplished short story writer, writing for the New Yorker,
mm-hmm.
where you have to create a situation, you have to hook the reader's interest in your first paragraph or so. Otherwise, they're not going to be interested in publishing you. And he brought those skills to this real life crime in cold blood. He uses cinematic techniques, you could say, which the films tend to follow, of cross-cutting. So you cut between the Clutters and Dick and Perry on their way to kill the Clutters. And he keeps doing that throughout the novel. When the Clutters are dead, he's cutting between the KBI agents like Dewey and Nye and Dick and Perry. And then it's not until quite near the end of the novel that he finally describes the killing itself. So you have that structural element that makes it so powerful. And also Capote's prose is very good. In the kind of way I mentioned in relation to his short stories, it plunges you into these different situations, these different settings. So you're in the Clutter's house, you're in the Clutter's minds, then you're in Dick and Perry's house, you're in Dick and Perry's minds, you're in Alvin Jr.'s house with his wife, and you're in Alvin's mind. So it goes on like that. So it's a very, very absorbing narrative. So it all starts, I think, from there. It's also the case that it has, and this is a point David Hayes makes, because he's an award-winning journalist himself, that it's set a kind of precedent for true crime writing. And a lot of those who have followed in his footsteps, including, I suppose, Norman Mailer, who was probably the quickest to follow with The Executioner's Song about Gary Gilmore. And it showed how it could be done. In other words, if you want to write a non-fiction book about a crime, you use the techniques of the novelist. That is, you use dialogue, you go into people's minds, and this can be dodgy. And one of the key controversies over In Cold Blood is that Capote made the rather rash claim that it was 100% truth.
Right.
He made this claim that the figure varies, that he trained himself to remember conversations so he could remember 94 or 97% of what people actually said. And anybody who's ever done interviews knows that this is a very rash claim. And of course, very quickly after the book had appeared, there were articles pointing out all the discrepancies in it. And what, of course, you get now, and you can see it very common now in films based on some kind of true crime. They will say based on a true story. Right. They will say some incidents have been fictionalized. And that's a useful disclaimer that Capote didn't make. In terms of the issues it touches on, it clearly does come back to that most fundamental issue of why people kill, and also why they might kill when there's no obvious motive, like trying to get a lot of money or a crime passionnel, a crime of passion out of jealousy. Why are people killing? Apparently for the fun of it. So it's that fundamental question. And then it also raises further questions about, is there any way in which one could possibly atone or compensate the relatives of the victims? There's the issue of what you then do with the criminals themselves. Do you execute them? Do you keep them in prison? Do you let them linger for a long time before executing them? All those questions as well. And the other point, perhaps also worth making about In Cold Blood, is quite significant, is to what extent can a psychological explanation that is convincing be made? How do you explain this? One of the crucial things about In Cold Blood, the way it works, is that because of the law situation in Kansas at this time, lengthy psychiatric testimony was not allowed. They were simply asked, the psychiatrist was simply asked to say whether he thought that Dick and Perry could tell the difference between right and wrong legally, not necessarily morally, but did they know what they were doing was against the law? And of course, the psychiatrist answered yes, as he had to. They clearly did. The Macnaghten rules, which were established in England in the 19th century, which you would know about, were therefore being used. But what Capote does is to say the psychiatrist was not allowed to testify, but if he had testified, he might have said, and so therefore you do get in the novel, which you wouldn't get if you were, for example, reading the court transcripts, various psychological perspectives on Dick and Perry. The novel doesn't really come down on one side or the other. It leaves the reader free to decide or to indeed devise another explanation. But you get those there too. And then, of course, the whole set of issues, as they say, around capital punishment. So it actually succeeds as a novel, both in being a compelling read, but also concentrating all these issues, which of course are still very much debated today. Capital punishment is still hotly debated today. How far you should allow an excuse of insanity to mean that somebody should be exculpated for murder is still a large issue today. So it's very much ongoing, and I think that's another reason it touches lots of contemporary nerves. By contemporary, I mean 21st century nerves, 2020 nerves.
Yeah, the United States had the Macnaghten rule, and depending on which state you're in about insanity, we may have the American Legal Institute rule. Could you conform your behavior to the law? And then there's older rules about would you have committed the crime if a police officer was right there?
That's an interesting one.
Is a comparison. Yes. So it's kind of like how do you know what someone was thinking or how they were able to comport their behavior to any particular set of events?
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, that is still very, very much an ongoing question. And I think one of the things also, continuing with this insanity and crime and punishment issue, is that when Dick and Perry are on death row, there are other people on death row with them. And so it constitutes, in a grim kind of way, a kind of laboratory in which you can look at why people might have done what they did. So you've got Dick and Perry, you've got York and Latham, whom I mentioned earlier, who killed 7 people. It's interesting your point about the states, because they'd done this in several different states. And the different states were actually vying to try and capture them and execute them. Of course, it would have been different methods in different states, electrocution in some, lethal injection in other, hanging, of course, in canvas. And the other grimly fascinating figure who was on death row was a young man called Lowell Lee Andrews. And Andrews was a huge man, a kind of gentle giant he seemed to be, who one evening was reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov in his room. He shaved, put his suit on, he went downstairs, and he shot first his sister, then his father, and his mother dead. And he made various appeals, but eventually he too was hung. And that again, you raise the question, is somebody who does that crazy? Well, yes, obviously, in any sense. Again, it doesn't seem there was any particular motive for it. And so you have those comparisons. You have Dick and Perry, you have York and Latham, you have Lowell Lee Andrews, and they're all together in death row. In fact, York and Latham were the last people to be executed by hanging in Kansas in the 20th century. So the death row scenes, which are harrowing in a way, but they're also very compelling. And they really do put you up against this question of why somebody would do this and what on earth can be done with people who've done this.
So Andrews was reading Brothers Karamazov, not Crime and Punishment?
Yes. He was a well-read young man, and he continued to read when he was in prison. He was an example, in fact, going back to Colin Wilson, of a Colin Wilson outsider. But the direction he took was destructive of others and of himself. It's extremely difficult to explain. It wasn't a situation. You get, of course, domestic violence where one member of a family kills another, but there wasn't any sense in this case of any overt tensions in the family. So he too is a compelling figure. And I think another strength of In Cold Blood is the way in which Capote offers you the case histories of these people, and he evokes them for you. There's a very powerful scene where Dick and Perry watch Andrews. They can just see out of their cell. They watch him being taken to the warehouse, the corner, as it's called, which is where the executions take place. So, as I said, I think that too is another element of the novel which makes it very powerful, but also makes you ask a lot of questions and enter into a lot of debates.
In one of the writers, Torsten Peterson's essay acknowledges the multiplying criticisms of In Cold Blood's departure from fact, as we mentioned, which have become more strident in the 21st century, but argues that while the book fails as a reliable factual account, it succeeds as a novel, as a literary work.
Yes, I think that is true. That is the case. It does undoubtedly succeed as a literary work for the reasons that I've suggested. At the same time, one can say, I think, David Hayes says this, for example, that it isn't quite enough, that because it's being offered as, if not 100% truth, largely true, you feel you need to trust it a bit more. And it's worth noting that Alvin Dewey, who, as I said, got very close to Capote, said that he agreed that there were inaccuracies. And there's an invented chapter right at the end where Susan Kidwell, who was Nancy's friend, meets Dewey in the graveyard in Holcomb. And that seems to be entirely invented. But Dewey nonetheless thought that it was essentially true, as he said. Of course, Agent Nye, who said he had not been given sufficient credit in the investigation, thought rather differently. But yes, I think it does succeed as a novel. At the same time, I don't think you can quite read it as just as a novel, because it is true. And of course, there are people who are still alive. Bobby Rupp, who was Nancy's girlfriend, who, as I mentioned, was an initial suspect who was interrogated by the KPI, is still alive. He still lives in Holcomb. He's married to someone else. He's got children, but he still regularly places flowers on Nancy's grave. You've got the other members of the Clutter family who are still alive. You've also got Dick's children. I mentioned he was married and a father a couple of times. Maybe grandchildren who are still around. So I was very conscious of this in writing it, that there are all these sensitivities of people who are still living and around, and I think other people were as well. So I think that while it does succeed as a novel, you've also got to be aware of the fact that it's being presented as truth, and be aware of the fact that there may be other stories or other accounts that need now to be taken into consideration.
One of the essays, I'm looking for it here, but it's asking the question: is a completely factual presentation of a story like this in this form even really possible? Because it seemed like you have to portray the feeling, the emotion, the context of it in a certain way. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that the essay you mentioned was, I think, making the point that what Capote does is he tries to blend two genres. He tries to blend a non-fiction account of the murders with a novel. And that's, of course, very effective in the ways I've suggested. It gets you into the situations, it gets you into the characters, but you're almost inevitably bound to make things up to a greater or lesser extent, not maliciously, but if you're thinking back on what might, for example, the Clutters have been saying to each other on the evening of their murder, before the murderers arrived. And Capote, even if he had a tape recorder and actually been there, could never have been that accurate. So yes, I think they are incompatible. If you make the claim, as Capote rather rashly did, that you're offering 100% truth, if you make the kind of claim that you often find now in novels and films, which says that this is based on a true story, then you get out of it. But I think you're never going to get away from that. But the question would be, would you ever actually be able to produce an immaculately factual, to use the term Capote himself used, account of anything? because you're always going to be looking at it from a particular viewpoint. Your information is never going to be complete. And so I think it's very difficult, even if you're writing a completely documentary account. And there could be an argument. It's best to say, yeah, not all of this is true. Sometimes I'm guessing, sometimes I'm speculating. This is what Norman Mailer says in relation to the armies of the night, for example, that he knows that this isn't necessarily all going to be true, but his imaginative intuition will enable him to penetrate to the heart of things in a way a documentary account might not. Again, you're on dodgy ground, I think, when you say that, but it may be inevitable.
We had a previous guest who had a book called Crime Exploitation. It focuses on some of the television shows, some of the specials, that kind of media that may be exploiting criminal cases just for their shock value, for their emotion.
Yes.
And I had not even thought about literature. Do you think there's a danger, even in cold blood, does it exploit cases like this and do some kind of harm?
I think there is undoubtedly a danger of that. I think one could even argue that the better written a novel is, the more dangerous it is. It's more convincing. Certainly, we know that the remaining Clutter family, because they weren't all killed, there were two grown-up daughters who were living away. They are still alive, I believe. And they, of course, were very upset by the book because they felt the portrayal of their father was inaccurate. And they have been very averse to giving any interviews about it. They did finally involve themselves quite recently in making a documentary and creating a kind of scrapbook for their family, which was designed to show the more positive side of the Clutters. So yes, I think it's there. The only thing I would say, I think it's been since the birth of journalism in, say, in England in the 18th century, and probably earlier, there is a keen interest in true crime. People write about it, they write ballads about it, they're fascinated by it. A lot of English literature, Defoe's Moll Flanders, for example, deals with people who are criminals. So there is that general fascination there. But clearly today, the nature of the media we have today makes that exploitation much harder. And it must be, of course, extremely painful for anyone who has literally been involved in this kind of event one way or another to be aware of all that is going on. And as I say, I was conscious of that in compiling the book and putting it together. It did concern me. On the other hand, I felt that the interest in it, this is of course, the usual justification, the public interest was so great that it might be useful for people to be better informed about all the possibilities, including, and this is quite well emphasized in many parts of the collection, including all those ways it does depart from fact, or does seem to give a misleading impression of the various characters. But that of course, applies to others too. I think quite recently, a descendant, I think, of Joseph Douglas Latham, one of the two killers I mentioned who were on death row, she said, well, there was I believe, a dramatization of this on TV. She said it gives a completely inaccurate impression of what he was actually like. So that's always going to happen because people have different subjective viewpoints, I think. But the exploitation, yes, I think that's a real issue, and it's particularly an issue today. At the same time, I think it's very, very difficult to stop, even with very heavy censorship. Even in the communist countries or the old Soviet Union, there was still a keen interest in crime, and information and news about it circulated, even when you had heavy censorship.
And why such an interest in crime that's gone on for so long, and it's in so many different areas now. Some of a high quality, some maybe not so high quality. Because I've had true crime writers before, and I've asked them about, what do you think? Where's the interest come from in true crime?
I think one might make a distinction between types of crime. I think if you're talking about murder, that's the ultimate transgression in Western culture, it goes back to the Bible. The story of Cain and Abel is one of the first signs of the world after the fall. There's something very fundamental about it. No society has not had a prohibition against murder. They may allow killing in certain circumstances in war, for example, but it seems to be a universal taboo. And I think with other kinds of crime, let's take financial fraud, for example, because there's been quite a lot of films and documentaries and such about that. I think, again, there's the fascination of transgression. There's the fascination, perhaps also in that respect, of perhaps seeing someone who in some ways is beating the system in a certain kind of way. So I think you could perhaps put it under the general rubric of transgression. So there's something exciting, fascinating, interesting about it, even for people, or perhaps especially for people who would never dream of doing such a thing in their everyday lives. If you think in terms of fiction, there's the popularity. I don't know if they use this category in the States, but in England, they use the category for novels like Agatha Christie, Dorothy O'Sayers, detective stories of cozy crime. And there's this idea that you settle down in your safe house, so there's not a home invasion, and you read about murder. So there it is. It's a primal thing. Murder being the ultimate transgression, but the other kinds of transgression being interesting as well. The confidence trickster, for example, is a fascinating figure. I think in both the States and in England. There was a TV series in England called Hustle, the film called American Hustle. And there's a fascination with seeing how it's done, the skills that are brought to bear.
And for, I was just thinking when you were talking earlier about Colin Wilson, he talked a lot of kind of Maslowian patterns in crime of ages ago. They may commit out of economic necessity for resources.
Sure.
And then in more and more in modern eras, committing crime for the purpose of self-esteem.
Sure.
And that I wonder if the Clutter murders, in light of talking about this, was related to self-esteem as a motive.
I think it was. I think Capote himself said something. He said it about Perry. He said you can't go on going through life forever without getting anything you want. There was the sense that Perry, who had dreams of being a successful musician, performing at Las Vegas, had really not got anything he wanted. So the crime was a way of establishing himself, as it was for Dick. It's perhaps a terrible thing to say, but it's a way of achieving a kind of immortality. We would never be talking about Dick Hickock and Perry Smith if they had not conducted those killings. And there's certainly a sense that Dick, for example, certainly felt in something he wrote himself that he was going to go through with this killing because this would put him on the map, whatever happened afterwards. And that, in a twisted way, is precisely the Maslowian idea of self-esteem. You try to achieve self-esteem in this way. And of course, you don't in various ways, but you do achieve a reputation. Our fascination, if we go back to that, our fascination with the murderer, sometimes to the exclusion of a concern for the victim, which is still quite strong. And ethically, it's appalling in a way, but I think it's also understandable. But I think that kind of analysis you mentioned, Colin Wilson, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once you've got food and everything else, you need self-esteem, is a good way of looking at what Dick and Perry did. And I think Wilson's attitude was interesting because when he first went in Cold Blood, he wasn't all that impressed, but he came greatly to admire it. And I think he admired it because he could see that it was, in some sense, showing murderers who fitted the kinds of patterns he'd outlined. And time and again, you do feel with Dick and Perry, or I do anyway, that I wish they'd gone straight. I wish they'd got a proper job where they could have found some outlet for their varied abilities, which, as I suggested earlier, were quite considerable. There's no reason, in a way, why they couldn't have made a success in various fields in the world. But they wanted to do more. And it's another point Wilson makes, that they took a shortcut to it, that crime, and particularly murder, is a shortcut to try and achieve an intensity and a reputation that otherwise might take years and years to attain.
Behaviorally, when I think about this case, I think about what I've said about maybe the rise of serial murder and other kinds of what we see as bizarre murder in the years since. Is part of it is the rise of the interstate highway system and all the features of modern society that provide opportunity. So in a sense, I wonder if Capote's writing was a little bit prescient about this is a changing world. We're going to have things that we never even imagined before, and some of it will shock us because the context of the world has changed, and now we're going to have a different kind of criminal.
Yes, I think so. I think what you've said there is another good reason for its durability, that it is prescient, that it does see things that would become much more common. And your point about interstate highways is very interesting because, of course, one of the key things about In Cold Blood is the contrast between the settled world of the farm and Perry and Dick bowling along these interstate highways, which, of course, on one level is very exciting. It's the American, I've hitchhiked around America, and I know this, the American pioneering spirit traveling through those enormous landscapes. But, of course, it does also make it more possible to do something and flee from the scene of the crime rather than a crime that's committed within a local community. And you could say, yes, you could say it anticipates our world where we can move very quickly about the globe and all kinds of things can happen in all kinds of places. And the increase in the crime that's conducted purely for sensation. So perhaps there's a terrible sense that Dick and Perry, for example, or York and Latham were prototypes that were followed. And of course, it's also possible, particularly now, and this is perhaps another significant factor, for people to go on the internet and read in detail about these crimes. So it's the copycat factor, if you like. So there might be someone somewhere now reading about Dick and Perry. It's a horrific thought, but nonetheless thinking, hey, that's a way to put myself on the map.
And now we have criminals that can commit their crimes live on a live stream and broadcast it.
You're quite right. That's a very good point. So too, yes, and you feel that Dick and Perry might quite have liked to do that. That would have been Perry's big moment. So yes, that is an absolutely chilling but compelling factor as well. And again, I would agree with you that I think you could see that anticipated in Capote's In Cold Blood, and that is a key reason for why we're still reading it, apart from the other elements that I've mentioned.
I want to quickly, I'll say that among the essays that you've included in here, bloodlines, ethnicity, and otherness in Cold Blood. Yes. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yes, sure. I think that one of the points that Capote makes early on is that the population of Holcomb, it contains people of Norwegian, Swedish, German, and even Japanese origin, in fact. So in a sense, it's living up to the American ideal of the melting pot. All these people are getting together. They have a common commitment to the American way of life. Then you've got a sense of people coming from the outside, like Dick and Perry. There's a very interesting moment where one local person says he saw these two Mexicans hanging around Herbert Clutter's house. The police investigate this and they can't find any evidence for it. But in a sense, it would be a relief against the community if it did come outside, the two Mexicans in that sort of way. The portrayal of the Japanese family is quite interesting, and it's one of the things I discuss because it's not that long after Pearl Harbor. It's not that long after Japanese civilians were interned in camps, and yet by this time you get this fully integrated family whom Herb pays tribute to at one of the local associations of which he is chairman. So you've got this society that seems to be fitted together very well, but you've also got this sense of others coming in from the outside. Or where do Dick and Perry try to escape to? They try to escape to Mexico. They don't actually last very long there, but that's where they can't really come back to America, in fact, which is one of the reasons they get caught, one of the reasons for their absurd inefficiency in a sense. But again, you get that sense of a kind of ethnic otherness. So I think that's an interesting element there.
Mm-hmm. Questions Left Hanging, the 1996 film of In Cold Blood. I think it was a television film. Is that right? It had Sam Neill in it. What can you tell us?
It was a television film. Yes, it was therefore rather longer than the original feature film, which Capote very much admired the original film, but he said it should have been 9 hours long. The second film, the 1996 film, wasn't 9 hours long, but it was rather longer. And I think the original film is very good. I'll say that first of all.
The original film that they had, I think it had Robert Blake in it, didn't it?
It had Robert Blake in. Yes, who would later stand trial for murder himself in later life. Yes. But he gave a superb performance. Indeed, Capote said when he first met Blake, it was uncanny because he thought, yes, this is just like Perry Smith. Okay. And so you have that. It was deliberately shot in black and white. It was a neo-noir film. Most films like Bonnie and Clyde, for example, but 67 were made in colour, so it was going back to that retro mode, looking like a 40s film. Very good. The 1996 film, since you asked specifically about that, was made for television. It's rather longer. It is a fascinating film in a whole range of respects. One of the things it does that is not in the earlier film is that it does from the start emphasise what is also very important in the book, which is that both Dick and Perry suffer from some form of disfigurement, a physical impairment. There's a description in the book, which I think was actually originally written by Harper Lee, that when you look at Dick's face, it's divided into two halves. Now, everybody's face is divided into two halves to some extent if you look at them. But in Dick's case, after a motor accident, so it looks as if it's been split in two and put back in perfectly together. And in the novel, this sense is in the 1996 film, this is emphasised by the fact that we have a close-up on a kind of scar below Dick's eye. In the earlier film, where Scott Wilson plays the role, there isn't that. He looks fine, but you're immediately made aware that Dick has this rather sinister element in his face. Similarly, there's a shot, again in an early scene, of Perry sitting on the bed with his undershorts on, and you can see his legs, and you can see how badly damaged they've been from the motorbike accident. So that is an element that is in the book that is not in the first film, but is in the second film. And there's, of course, both a real and symbolic implication that these are figures who have been physically as well as psychologically damaged. One other interesting element I'll mention is towards the end of the film, which relates to my title for that essay, Questions Left Hanging. In the book, Capote describes Dewey being present at the executions, but he says that when Perry was executed, Dewey closed his eyes. Dewey denies this. No, we can't adjudicate. But of course, Capote has suggested that in some way he was affected, sensitive to Perry's death in a way he wasn't to Dick's. What they do in the film is he has his hat on and his brim is down and it shadows his eyes. So you can't actually see whether he closes his eyes or not. And that is actually, I think, very skillful because there's an ambiguity over the truth of the book itself. Did Dewey close his eyes? If so, what did it mean? Did he not close his eyes, but Dewey wanted him to close his eyes? So I think, in other words, it's a film made with an awareness that Capote's account can't wholly be trusted.
Perry was shaking Dewey's hand as he was led up to the gallows.
And Dick, yes. I mean, they were impressed by Dick's bearing. Agent Nye said this. He figured the guy for a coward, but there wasn't any sense of this. I suppose you could say, in a way, for both of them, it was their big moment. It was the culmination of all they'd done. And certainly Dick showed himself to be brave at the moment of his execution. Nothing became his life like the leaving of it, as he said in that bit. And that comes across again. It comes across in the film. One of the striking things, I think, about both films, in fact, but particularly the 1996 film, is it does bring across both how terrifying Dick was, but also how likable he was. This is why he was such a good con man. It's also why he could seduce underage girls and such like. So that comes across effectively.
I like the film Capote, where they would kind of juxtapose Capote's New York kind of pretentious cocktail party life, and then go back to cut back again and again. They'd cut back to Kansas, the investigation. They kind of had a gray look to it. I like the contrast there.
Yes. I think that was very, very effective, and it does convey a reality that although Capote had actually, as I say, come from a very small town in the South, not wholly unlike Holcomb, that's obviously a different part of America, he'd become very successful in New York, part of the glitterati, the literati, but then he'd gone back to do this, and although he still kept his New York identity, you got the sense that he was really always thinking about what was happening in Kansas, partly because he was writing a book about it, partly because it obsessed him in certain ways.
Well, we've gone well over an hour, and it seems like it's flown by because there's just so much to talk about. So,
yes.
Critical Insights in Cold Blood.
Yes, that's right. Yes, published by Salem Press. Yeah,
by Salem Press. You are the editor, along with many authors on here.
Yes, that's right. Yes, indeed.
Well, we'll have a link. I encourage people to read it. It's fascinating. I enjoy this kind of thing about a particular book and a particular case.
Thank you.
You going to write anything like that in the future, you think?
I'm not sure. One result of the book is that there's quite a lot left over that I might like to say and that I might like to investigate. And in some sense, I'll see what happens. It's not impossible that I might feel like writing a book entirely of my own about Capote, and particularly about In Cold Blood. But it's certainly an interest that will continue. I should say my wife, too, who wrote the biographical essay, also became extremely interested in Capote and in the whole In Cold Blood phenomenon of the books and the films, though it's made us extremely careful always to check that we've locked the door firmly at night.
Yes, that's it. No longer are the days where everybody leaves their doors unlocked.
Absolutely, and this was one of the things with Herb, of course. He'd left his door unlocked. When Dick and Perry arrived, they didn't have to force an entry. They could just get in.
They just walked in.
They just walked in.
Thank you so much for being part, and we'll be in touch in the future, and maybe someday we'll have another Colin Wilson conference.
That would be good. I hope we can do that. Thank you very much for your very intelligent and interesting questions, and for the opportunity to talk at length about this book and the whole In Cold Blood phenomenon.
This has been Criminal Behaviorology. Check us out on podomatic.com or anchor.fm. Please send questions, comments and requests for transcripts to criminalbehaviorology@gmail.com.